Good morning. I'm going to talk in the next 45 minutes about Xdebug 3.0. Hi, I'm Derick. I'm European. Ik spreek ook Nederlands because I'm originally from here, but I won't confuse you too much by switching languages, or rather confuse myself by switching languages too much. It's always quite tricky to do that for me. I work on many PHP things. Xdebug is one of them. PHP's daytime support is another one. I also host a podcast called PHP Internals News, if you have not seen it before. Well, sorry, if you have not listened to it before, go have a look. I talk about with other PHP internals developers about new features that are going to make it into PHP at some point. I like maps, whiskey, and beer, but we won't be talking much about that today. What I want to talk about is Xdebug 3.0. Now, at the moment, that's not been released yet, so apologies if that's the reason why you were here. But I will tell you and talk to you about what needs to be done to get there and the reasons why and how this is going to look like, hopefully sort of before the end of the year. Big hope there, big hope. So Xdebug is an old code base. It's 17 years old. How many of you work with a code base that is that old? A few. How would you think the quality of that code base is? Well, imagine that, and that is exactly how Xdebug looks like as well. As users, I'm sure you ran into many annoying issues in there. How many of you know about all the configuration options? All 65 of them? I don't know, so I don't expect you to know that either. There's some issues in it, but usability. And I have some examples of those in a moment. As you might be aware, if you load Xdebug, things go slower. That's not always good either. And there's the issue that Xdebug versions, so the releases sometimes lag behind. Like PHP 7.3 came out somewhere in December, and Xdebug, to make use of it, came only out somewhere in March, I believe. So these are the configuration settings that are in Xdebug. And I am not expecting you to read all of them, because I certainly won't do that either. But there's a few in there that are basically doing the same thing. So, for example, the ones in green, GC stats output there, and profiler output there, and trace output there, they're basically all telling you, use this directly to put data in. Why are there 3 of them? Well, it's because it's a 17-year-old code base, right? There's also a few that make no sense whatsoever. There's the remote handler one. It allows you to change which protocol Xdebug uses to talk to IDEs. There is only one, so why is it there? Another one, extended info. Why is it there? It's actually no longer there because I just deleted that early last week. But what it signaled to the PHP runtime to add extra instructions so that Xdebug can break on these instructions. You always need that if the debugger is enabled, so it's now just always enabled when you use the debugger, and things like that. But there's a whole bunch more, and are really quite complicated, and although the documentation is all right, I think it is not always as obvious what the amount of configurability actually is. So I want to improve on that. Then there's things like when you do single-step debugging, sometimes you miss breakpoints, right? So let me actually go try this out because I like doing live demos. Just before I came onto stage, I had to install a new version of PHP Storm because my advanced version had, what's the word for that? Had expired. Let me switch. So I have many PHP versions here. So I need to switch between all the new versions. Export. Again, this is a complicated, make it a bit bigger for you actually, invocation that you need to do debugging on a command line, right? It's not particularly nice to have to do this. And then we run, well, with the missing breakpoint, and then nothing happens because, of course, I forgot to start the debugger. Always. This, interesting. Live demos, I know what I'm doing wrong, so don't worry. It helps that you actually turn it on. Again, something else that I think should have been easier. And of course now nothing happens because as you expect it stopped here in the ID. So if I set a breakpoint on this line here, run the script, anyone wants to guess what happens? And nothing, it doesn't stop at all. And why is this? Well, PHP isn't always very good about telling you or showing where code actually happens. I mean, even though I set a breakpoint on line 4, there's actually no code on there, even though there's an if statement. But PHP internally, if doesn't really mean anything for its internal engine, so there's no code. So if there's no code, you can't stop. This is kind of annoying because you clearly wanted it to stop there. So that's annoying. It is a demo. So when you look at this actually in the bytecode itself, well, first of all, there's lots of arguments here. That isn't matter, but the important thing is that what is missing here is anything on line 4. Because the first code, which is where the if statement is the one on line 5. That's what this jump set does. So this is kind of annoying. If any of you use PFPM with Xdebug, you probably know that both of them use port 9000, which conflicts. Xdebug was first with its DBG protocol. PFPM came about 5 years later. Why they picked the same number, I don't know. It's annoying, and something needs to be done there. Sad face. I've already shown you that activating the step debugger isn't always particularly easy. I mean, you just saw me flumming to my demo there for a moment, where you need to enable it, and there are settings like remote host, remote port, or sometimes there's remote connect back, in case you use a development machine with lots of people debugging and stuff like that. This is all kind of complicated, but it's mostly complicated not because of either PHP or Xdebug or the IDE particularly. What it is usually complicated about is that networking gets trickier the more parts you add to your stack. If you're just on a single machine, this is all easy. If it's just a development machine, and you are on your development machine, on your IDE work machine, that's easy as well. But when you start introducing Docker or VMs or anything like that, many more different parts of networking come into play, which makes it sometimes really difficult to get the debugger going. You should that on the shell. So the versions of Xdebug that were released in the last 2 years, they have a functionality called it's the remote logging functionality that will tell you when debug connections could be made and what Xdebug is actually trying to do. So for example, if you have these two configured, like remote connect back is 0 to turn it off, and a remote port is 9991, which is in this case the correct one, then the log will tell you, well, we're trying to connect to this IP address and port number, and it works, so we get a smiley face. And of course, if it doesn't do it, it will then tell you exactly why it tried to connect to and also why it didn't work. I mean, at the moment, it's even more verbose than on the slide, because it will tell you why the socket couldn't be created and things like that. This is very, very useful for both you to debug what's going on, but it's also, additionally, if something goes wrong with the debugging protocol afterwards, the communication between Xdebug and the IDE will also be part of that, which is vital for me to find bugs in Xdebug. Debugging the debugger is always a fun thing to do. And then there's, of course, performance issues. Code coverage is really quite slow, although there's some improvement made in the latest version, but it is slow because it has to do a lot, but it also does a lot more than it has to do. If you want to run with code coverage, you're not interested in stack traces showing up at the same time. If you're doing the step debugger, it makes no sense to have the profiler turn on at the same time, and so on and so on. There's no reason to have all these things turned on because you're only going to be using one at a time. And by having all the features enabled at the same time, you end up making it slower than it really ought to be. Right. There's also the thing is that I have to test with many, many versions. This list is now outdated because more versions of PHP were released, but there are many of them. And there are many different variants. There's versions that are thread safe, which are the ZTS variants here. The ones that are 32-bit, some people still use 32-bit PHPs, which is unfortunate because it means I have to test for it. And if I want to test all of them, I also need to think about whether op cache is turned on or off, because that would create differences in how PHP interprets its code sometimes. And testing all of these on things like Travis CI or anything like cloud-based continuous integration platforms, you can't do because it takes too long, right? Travis gives you 5 concurrent requests at the same time. I'm testing 140-ish versions. They all take about 5 to 6 minutes. And you can calculate how long this takes. It's just way too much time. And I'm not even considering testing all these things on Windows, because there's Behaviour for that, where you have one request at the same time, and it takes about 10 minutes. It takes days to run against all these versions, so I can't really do that. But I really should, because small changes in between minor versions of PHP sometimes break things in Xdebug. All right, so I've spoken about some of the problems. Now, what are the solutions to this? Well, first of all, what I'd like to do is to make it at least easier for me to find issues, is to set up a CI system, continuous integration system locally. So I can test against all my PHP versions, of which I have many, but what I also would like to do is test against versions of PHP that haven't been released yet. Every minor version of PHP or major version of PHP, there's so many internal changes that for me to effectively keep Xdebug up to date with that, I need to know when things are changed. And the only way how we can do that is by basically running against nightly builds of PHP. So I've started working on that. Not quite I'm not quite ready with that yet, but that's in progress. And then I basically want to refactor Xdebug's codebase. It's 17 years old. It's buggy in places. It's unreadable in other places, to be honest. I like using very short variables because that made a lot of sense back then. I have learned, and that's a mistake. Some focus would also like to do on education, like how does the networking interact with Xdebug? Talk a little bit about all the settings in there, how Xdebug interacts with IDEs. There's too little information in there that I need to work on. And then the last big thing is I need to figure out, in some cases where Xdebug ends up being slower than people would expect, I want to work on the algorithms in there to see whether I can make that better. This is a lot of work. This is probably full year's work of time. And well, I do need to eat at some point, so without any sponsorship, this is not going to happen. I'll get back on that in a moment. All right, so what's the plan? The first one to come out is Xdebug 2.8, where I want to first improve the breakpoint behavior, and there's a tick behind it, which means it now works. So let me show you that. Switch to a different PHP version that has a new version of Xdebug. Run this again. It stops again. My breakpoint is still there. I press run, and it then stops on the line just after it, because what it will do is it will start finding lines that you can actually do the breakpoint on. Just well, at the moment it does the first 10 lines after the line you set it on, but that's a bit too much sometimes, and I'll tell you in a moment why. I'll want to change it to only 5 lines. So the reason why sometimes 10 isn't a good idea is because if, for example, in the other example here that I have, let me switch to that for a moment. I have a closure here. And closures are a very similar thing here. Now, I've set a breakpoint here on line 6. Let me reset that and then run it. Closure. Now, let me run it. And then you see it stops on line 12. Because PHP or Xdebug can only know when there's executable lines when the function is already been executed. Because the closure doesn't exist yet, the breakpoint is already sent from the IDE to Xdebug. So we set a breakpoint on line 6, but that code doesn't exist yet. But the code that does exist is code on line 12. So because that's the first breakpoint I can find, it will then pause it on there. Now, this needs a bit of tweaking to make this a bit more clever. Or clever is probably hard to do, but a little bit better. So I don't want it to skip by 10 lines, by say 5. Because if I press now, go again, it will then stop on the line that you sort of expected it to stop on. So the only thing that this really does is it stops on more lines that you want it to do, which is kind of annoying, but probably not going to be avoidable. But going from the 10 lines to 5 should make this a lot better, because most of your functions or methods are hopefully more than 2 lines, and not too many. So that's done. It's had not been merged yet, but this is done mostly. Initial PHP 7.4 support, well, you saw that as well. My branch here is called, the other branch was called PHP 7.4 support. It works. but the tests don't fully work yet, because internal changes in PHP means that the tests sometimes produce different results, although they're not necessarily incorrect results. That should be done soonish, once maybe hopefully with the code nights tonight, I hope to work on that, so that should nearly be done. Setting up a local CI I've done as well. But the big thing comes with Xdebug 3.0 when I need to do many things, and there's a few things that I want to do. I want to start introducing modes, so you can put Xdebug in either. Okay, I'll talk about that in a moment. Sorry, I'm skipping ahead of my own thing here. So I want to do a big refactor there and do the performance improvements in Xdebug 3.0. So in 2.8, the breakpoint behavior. Well, it's kind of interesting because the first time I actually run this myself, I got confused because there's a few things missing if you look at the code in the closure. So the code in the closure, if you look at PHP internals here, what does it show? Well, it shows a no operation, a statement. These are the places where Xdebug can break. Another statement and a return. Anybody sees what's missing here? It's kind of obvious. There's a variable assignment here, right? But that's gone. It's gone from the generated code in PHP. Why is this? Well, opcache has been loaded, and opcache removes everything that is useless. Well, removes many things that are useless. And doing a variable assignment and not doing anything with it is useless, so it removes the code. Not particularly useful. So turning off opcache, the code is back, and that means that breakpoints work properly again. So Xdebug will actually, when you activate the step debugger, it will turn off opcache's optimizations. It will still use the cached opcodes or the internal structures, but it will not do the optimizer. So this is not a problem, or less of a problem. I've done the demo, so skip over that. So there's big things internally that happens in PHP internals. New instructions get added. Sometimes the way how PHP works internally is different, like the way how internally you can look at properties of a class, for example, which is my second one here. And then you need to add those annoying things like if the PHP version ID is larger than 7.4, which is what the 70400 means, then we need to do something else, and so on and so on. And although PHP is getting better at getting these things documented for internal developers, it isn't 100% good enough for me not to run into problems, but at least I can ask some other people to help out with that, which is kind of cool. Right, so the local continuous integration. So I've mentioned that any cloud-based CI is way too slow due to the lack of parallelization, and any of the ones that I currently use. I use many different ones because they do things sometimes slightly better or slightly faster or slightly different, and it's always a good thing to test again as many different possibilities as I can, right? There's many configuration pivots, access, I'm not sure what the right word for this is, so there's at least 8 configurations per PHP version. There's differences between the PHP patch versions even, line changes for opcache, bug fixes in PHP, functions being turned into internal structures so they're no longer functions, like the strlen function, I believe in PHP 7.3, got turned into an internal structure, so it no longer shows up as a function call, which makes sense because it's a great optimization, but it does break tests sometimes. I have a really nice, big, fast desktop computer under my desk that has a lot of memory and cores, and I would like to be able to use that to do that kind of stuff. So that's what I'm currently working on, and then also do the nightly builds of PHP 7.4 and 8.0. And then the big thing is like Debug 3.0. So the code base at the moment, if you look at it, every file name starts with Xdebug, which is really annoying when you want to autocomplete anything. There also, beyond that, the code that should do one feature is often found in multiple files, making it kind of hard to maintain. As part of this, what I'd like to do is change all of these things in such a way that, for example, the step debugger is in one file or multiple set of files, or maybe in its own directory. The tracing functionality, the profile, and all these things, just to make it easier to maintain the code base. And making things easier to maintain means that I can, of course, do things faster. Then I want to introduce modes. So modes are a way of you telling Xdebug what thing you want from it at the moment. Well, the first one I want to have is off. At the moment, if you load Xdebug and you turn off most of its features, you still have quite a bit of an overhead. And that's not great, because it makes your normal development time go slower, right? So I wanted to introduce a mode that's called off, which allows you Xdebug to still be loaded, but do almost nothing. The only thing it will do is, well, it still might have to hook in some of the internal functions, so that it can do other things if you switch the mode and say a htaccess file and things like that, but otherwise it won't do anything. Then the mode is a debugging mode. This is the thing that would show you the stack traces, the nice orange boxes that you'll come to love, I'm sure, and things like that. Third one would be the step debugger. I haven't quite figured out where I want to be able to have the step debugger as well as the normal debug functionality on at the same time, because these are both things that you would be using while developing things, right? And the step debugger, which originally I called a remote debugger, but that's a silly name because it doesn't have to be remote. Rename to step debugger and improve the documentation for that, and work a little bit, maybe come up with ways how I can make the network communication work better between, say, Docker instances or Vagrant instances and things like that. Then the tracer functionality. And the tracer functionality, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that, allows you to dump every single function call, variable assignment, and return value to a file for you to analyze. And there's different formats of showing that information. One that's easier to read, and another one is easier to parse by computer because it's a tab separated file. Amazing if you have to work with a code base that you have never seen before. Then there's the profiler. The profiler works a little bit different than the tracer because it generates this file format that you can't read yourself, but it is an input file for a tool called kcachegrind, which would be great as a profiler. I don't want to change much to the functionality, but I want to have this as a separate mode so that if you're running the profiler, the step debug isn't enabled, because that makes no sense, right? If you're profiling and you have to wait for you to press go in your IDE, the profile is kind of useless. Then the last one is a code coverage mode, which is the mode you would run with PHP unit, with PHP unit's code coverage, or code coverage without PHP unit, which you can do as well. And that would make sure that it optimizes what Xdebug does to only do things for code coverage. And at the moment, it can't do that right yet. And then I want to look at a time traveler mode. So the tracer is really nice to see everything that's happened during an execution, but it is sometimes a little bit hard to see what is going on. And the step debugger is really nice to interactively step through an application. What I want to do with the time traveler mode is to combine these things, that a specific tracer format will dump your execution into probably a binary format to file, and then I write a little application around it that can play back this trace file, connect to your IDE so that you can debug something that has already happened, which means that the code in there wouldn't be executed anymore because, well, that's kind of tricky, right? How would you go back in a script and then press go again? I mean, it's really difficult to undo, for example, writes to a file or insert into a database. So the code won't be executed, but you can introspect every single state of every stack frame, every go press you do, and also allow you to go backward, which should be really nice for figuring out what has happened in the execution of a script without you having to execute it as well. So I'm looking forward to being able to work on that at some point. All right, the configuration settings, we go back to these again. As again, there are many of these. So I've started working on those a little bit. So I want to organize those a little bit according to which modes there are. So instead of just having, starting with the first line here, auto_trace, well, this is something that has to do with the tracer. So I want to create like this namespacey thing called trace. Or similarly, I want one for the remote debugger, which I've changed here. So at the moment there are underscores, but I want to change them into dots, just to make it more obvious what these settings are for. The ones in red are going to go away, either because I don't need them anymore, or they are being put into one specific one, like enabling coverage or enable default, which is showing stack traces. or enabling the profiler, or enabling the remote, the tracer. All of these things could be rolled up into a specific single setting for mode. Xdebug's extended info is gone. It's going to remove from Xdebug 2.8. And all the other things I want to change as well. I've also threatened people by turning on the screen setting by default. The screen configuration setting will disable the add operator. So the add operator you can use for disabling warnings and errors to being shown to users to the browser. And this is sometimes pretty much of an anti-pattern, because all the way back in the days when I still did PHP development, I remember that we had this PHP script. We had both a command line script as well as it being able to run through the website or through Apache. And it was working fine when we executed the code through Apache, but when we were doing it on the command line, it would just silent do nothing. We didn't know what was going on. And then at some point, I decided, well, maybe something is doing something strange. So I enabled the tracer functionality, and the tracer functionality indeed showed me all lines of code that were being executed, and at some point it was a MySQL connect, and after the MySQL connect, nothing showed up anymore. So this is weird. Usually this is a sign of PHP crashing or something like that, but that hadn't happened. When we started to have a look at the line of the code of what it was, is that MySQL connect would sometimes, if it couldn't connect to the web server, would throw a notice or a warning. So what one of my coworkers had done, they put an @ sign in front of it, so that wouldn't happen. That made a reasonable amount of sense. When we removed the @ sign, our error message had nothing to do with connecting to MySQL. What it did have to do anything with is the MySQL extension wasn't loaded. If it's not loaded, you get a fatal error, but because you have silenced the fatal error, you don't know what's going on more and you don't know what's going to happen. That made me introduce the screen option into Xdebug, which I still slightly threatening to turn on by default. But unfortunately not quite possible, because there's a few cases in PHP where you really have to use the @ operator. For example, when I think it's reading from a stream or something. And there's no other way of you detecting whether something went wrong instead of looking at the error message that's come back from it. PHP needs to change there, but it hasn't at the moment. All right. Then I want to have a look at all the performance issues. Xdebug 2.7 already introduced something new to do with code coverage, and these are filters. So what a filter allows you to do is to tell Xdebug for which parts of your PHP code base it should do code coverage for. If you think of it, if you have a project that you run unit tests with say PHP unit, often you might have lots of dependencies in the vendor folder. PHP unit ends up in a vendor folder, but you're not really interested in the code coverage of code that you haven't written. In some cases, the code that you haven't written is vastly larger than the amount of code that you have written. Before the filtering, PHP unit would not only do code coverage for the code that you have written, but also for itself and all of your dependencies. So code coverage would have been generated, and then PHP unit would discard it all because it was something that you configured in PHP unit's whitelist. With the new filter functionality in Xdebug 2.7, there's some trickery required at the moment to get it going. You end up cutting out all of the things that don't need to be instrumented. And in some cases, that speeds up code coverage generation 2, 3, 4 times, which is definitely worth looking into. Now, the only problem with this is that this is functionality that you need to do something about yourself, because although PHP unit knows, by reading your configuration file, which bits you want to see code coverage on, by the time it can discover that, it's already too late, because PHP and Xdebug have already done the instrumentation of all of PHP unit because the code has already been executed. So this filter needs to be configured before any code runs to prevent any instrumentation to being done. Sebastian and some contributors worked on this functionality, so PHP unit has that, but it isn't automatic yet for you. So that's one of the things. There's also a few algorithms in code coverage that are not optimal. Like at the moment, what happens every time a line of code is hit, it will add an element to an array if it doesn't exist yet with a line number, and it will tell it what happened on this line, whether it is executable code or whether the code got executed, whether it's that code or not. The structures that it uses to do so are PHP arrays. And these are not a very optimal solution unless you want to deal with normal PHP arrays. So quite a lot can be gained here, but it's going to take some time to refactor some of the algorithms. And so on and so on. So that's on there. So I talked a little bit about sponsoring me working on Xdebug. I don't want to make this too much of a pitch. I just want to draw your attention to this. Xdebug is open source. I've worked on this in my spare time for 17 years. Now I would like to spend more time on this, so I set up a Patreon account where you can support me working on Xdebug. But what is also very important is that I get good bug reports. Good bug reports describing exactly what goes on in your code base when something breaks up in Xdebug is very, very useful. I sometimes get bug reports saying, well, my application breaks. Yeah, that's it sometimes. Sometimes like, oh, you have this Docker container that's going to install 7 gigabytes of stuff. I also don't want to do that, and there's no need for it. There's no need for it for most cases. Everything that you'll be able to reproduce in a Docker container, you should be able to reproduce in something easier that I can install very easily. And the bug reports are getting better and better, but are not quite up to the point where I would like them. So if you ever find anything that you think is broken in Xdebug, use the issue tracker. Also, what doesn't work very well is complaining on Twitter. And there's unfortunately quite a lot of that as well. I try to reach out when I see these things, give them a little nudge. Please send me bug reports so I can look into this. It only very rarely happens, which is kind of sad. All right, last thing I want to talk about is the podcast, where we will talk about a little about PHP internals news. Come have a listen. But having said that, I'm sure you have some questions, and I'm happy to answer them. Or I'd like to hear what you see improved on Xdebug, or what is a pain point for you as well. Any questions? And I'm going to have to repeat the questions after you've asked them for audio recording. You got it first. Yes. Right now, Xdebug, coverage by line. Right. That is an excellent question. The question was, at the moment, Xdebug does code coverage by line. Is there some plan of doing it on branch or path coverage? Interestingly, Xdebug supports that. Xdebug supports this, but there are a few issues around that, mostly because it gets really slow the more complex your code becomes. Xdebug is going to have to analyze all the branches. That's pretty fast to do. But analyzing which paths you have is a problem with exponents, right? Every time you have an if statement, you have twice as many possibility paths, or sort of, not 100% like that, but it's often like that. So if you have a function that has 4 or 5 if statements or 4 statements, that's all right, because you get 2 to the 5th amount of paths, which is 32. Did I get that right? Maybe. 32, maybe. Or 64. And my math's not great. 2 to the 10th, however, becomes already more of a problem, because that's 1024. And at these moments, the instrumentation can still be done, but it becomes really hard to visualize it as well. Because how are you going to visualize which of those 1024 paths have been covered? So yes, Xdebug supports this functionality, but PHP units cannot visualize this information yet. And that is something that I hope some person works on, but I'm also going to say that it's going to be important to only do this for only very few functions that are, or methods that are very important for your business logic, because sometimes writing 1024 tests for one method just doesn't make sense to do, right? So it is there, but not quite ready yet for prime time. Right, there are more questions. Gentlemen here.
Yeah, so Xdebug does a lot of, well, seemingly unrelated things. Why does it all need to be rolled on in one extension rather than having multiple ones?
So that's a good question. So the question is, Xdebug does many things. Why does it need to be one extension? This is something I've something I've thought about. Would it make sense to have multiple extensions? There are a few issues with this. Code is still shared between all the different modes. So which means that the code would have to be duplicated into multiple extensions. Now, from a code-based organization point of view, I can work around it. That's not a problem. But the problem then becomes is what happens if you load multiple extensions at the same time. Or sometimes you might not always be able to install extensions that have been done for you by a system administrator, and then swapping out which one you load could also be tricky. The order of loading of extensions is going to get more complicated. So, because there is no difference between loading an extension and setting this new mode flag, by having just one extension with this mode flag, I'd be able to do the exact same thing without having the extra complexity of having multiple extensions. Does that make sense? Okay. Anything else? Yeah, go ahead there.
Do you think about allowing the modes to be set via a debug helper, like now you have the phrase or whatever on the fly?
So the question is whether you'd be able to set a mode through a browser extension that some of you use for enable either the tracer or the profiler. So my intention is definitely be able to do that. So that is still the slightly small overhead that Xdebug will still have to do, because it will have to look at your HTTP header. That's pretty fast. So yes, that's what I want to do, but at the same time, I also, at the moment, you can't turn on the profiler or you can't turn on the profiler in HT access either, because the profiler currently needs to start when the script starts, and that happens before other things happen. So I also want to work to improve on that, so that it is possible to turn all these things off almost when the script's already running. So you'll be able, well, for the tracer and the tracer you can already do that. You can already do it for different bits. But for both the profiler and single-step debugger, it isn't something you can currently do. But I definitely want to do that as well. Yeah, so that's part of the plan. All right, go ahead.
Also, someone prepared to help you in the code type?
That's an excellent question. At the moment, it will be helping me figure out and fixing the tests. So that's the thing I need to get done before I can do anything else. So that's what I'll be working on tonight. Yeah, go ahead there. Hi.
Maybe a little silly question, I'm just curious.
Yeah.
At one point you mentioned how functionality of Xdebug is shared across multiple files, and you had a slide
Yeah.
including some file called useful stuff.
Yes.
What's the role of that file?
Useful stuff has all the things in there that I didn't know where else to put. So it has things like I think it's URL encoding and base64 encoding. These things are in there. Although PHP has APIs for that, you can't always call that because many PHP internal functions operate on PHP internal structures, which, if I want to use an Xdebug, would create a lot more overhead. So I sort of cloned and copied some of that functionality work on Xdebug's internal data structures to make it go faster. So that kind of things, as well as creating a path out of some format characters, which you can use for naming either your trace or your profile file. That also sits in there because it just had no other place for putting it. It is basically my library of useful stuff, hence the name. Yeah. All right, anything else? No questions at all? Okay, that's fine. Next slide. So this presentation, every time I now give it, it's changed. So the slides of this will be online pretty soon. And I'm happy to hear what you think about what I've been talking about, either functionality-wise or what you think should be improved. And I'm very happy to receive emails. I'm pretty rubbish replying to them, but I'll get to it at some point. I would also very much like you to leave feedback on Join-In, both the presentation. Hopefully you learned something here. And I'm sure that at some point in the future, I'll be talking about exactly how you should use Xdebug 3.0. When I pitched this presentation back in, what was it, January, I had hoped to have been further along, but you know how these things go, right? It is still a spare time hobby project for me at the moment. Having said that, thank you very much for attending and enjoy the rest of the conference.